this was a time where science was starting to shrink the world. It was starting to bring everybody together, and all of a sudden, traveling the world was becoming more possible for an average person than it had ever been before. And so the sense of adventure and like every day there was a new amazing thing coming out that was changing. It was the Industrial Revolution. Like, it was changing life as we knew it. And so Jules Verne was sort of riding that wave, and people would read that and go like, what's next? Where is this technology going to lead us? Welcome, friends, to episode 279 of the Ink to Film podcast, where we read the book and then see the movie. I'm writer Luke Elliott.
And I'm filmmaker James Bailey.
And this week we discuss Jules Verne's 1872 novel, 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. This is something we've been needing to do for a long time, and I felt like it was a gap in my knowledge in the sci-fi genre. Now, of course, I was aware of Jules Verne. This is somebody you hear about. I've seen some adaptations, but I'd never read. And I wanted to look into his biography, find out who he was. I did all of that, so I'm excited to share all of that with you today, James. But this is a big one.
Jules Verne, really interesting figure for adventure stories and sci-fi, fantasy, maybe more so sci-fi. But I remember, after Harry Potter, when I was a kid, looking for more adventure stories, and my librarian actually recommended Jules Verne to me.
Oh, wow.
So I read 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. I read Journey to the Center of the Earth. But I was so young that it was just a fun adventure story. And, rereading it for the podcast was a trip. It feels like 1,000 adventures that you have all in the course of one book. Like, it's epic in scale. And if you globetrot all over the world, it's a big one. Yeah,
man. It's that lines up with everything I've heard about him. He got famous for writing adventure sci-fi books. He is considered one of the fathers of science fiction as a genre, one of the progenitors. I think most people look to Mary Shelley. That is another author we covered. Her book Frankenstein came out in 1818. So for reference, this is 1872. So predates this. He was a contemporary of H.G. Wells, who's an author we haven't got to yet, but I want to, who is also considered one of the sort of forefathers of it. Even Edgar Allan Poe, I was reading, popularized using science to like lend a sense of veracity to your stories. And he got famous for doing that in some of his work. And in fact, he was Jules Verne's favorite author, which we'll get into a little bit. He loved Edgar Allan Poe. So lots of cool stuff to talk about him. But what I think is most notable is that even among all of those authors, Jules Verne is known as someone who took science and did exhaustive research into the science of the day, and then would use that to extrapolate out into theoretical applications of existing science. And that kind of science fiction, now you see touches of it, right? Like we talked about why Frankenstein was written the way it was, and like there was theories and stuff, but like that goal and that preponderance of factual information that makes it into your book, that then you take the next step and the next step, that became a hallmark of science fiction as we know it today, right? And especially what we would call hard science fiction. So fiction that has at least a basis in real science. And that was something that Jules Verne is really one of the first people to do. So when I look at something like The Martian, even today, like if you follow it all the way back, you get to stuff by Jules Verne, right?
Yeah, and it does make those stories feel much more grounded to have the things that we're familiar with. Many things in this story are clearly fiction. They were legends or things like that find their way in. But since there's this background and basis in technology of the time, taking those steps forward, it really does flesh out the world and make it feel so fantastical and something that we could attain at some point. And do you think that, we've talked about this a few times actually as well. We talked about it with things like the communicators in Star Trek. Like you have to kind of look back at these stories some of the time and be like, does this device, submarine travel, I know it was kind of maybe coming up around this time, but some of the things that he extrapolates out, do those things exist because he wrote them and then people were like, let's try to make that? Or were they always going to exist and he was just kind of on the cutting edge?
I mean, that's just a discussion about science fiction in general, right? Like But I think it goes back to Verne, sure, and others. Yeah, I mean, when you're taking existing science and you're extrapolating out different ways to utilize it, um, then when some of that comes true, it's like who came up with that idea? Like sometimes stuff is developed independently because he was just right about how some of that stuff could be used, and a lot of times he's wrong.
Yeah, I was gonna say,
but
there's
we
some
tend to
stuff in here.
remember the times where he's right, and he's famous for the times where he's right. But there's plenty of times where he was very wrong. So, and he did a lot of that in all these books, and he was a prolific author, wrote a ton of novels. Excited to get into his biography and talk about him more as a person. I think that's going to be actually a big chunk of this episode.
Yeah.
Because there's a lot to get into there.
I am excited to find out whether he was this explorer. I know he's very curious about this kind of stuff, but I want to know, was he worldly? Was he traveled? Is this something that he liked in theory, or was this something that he also became a part of? Because it feels like Captain Nemo might have been.
I'll just go ahead and answer that one. Not really. He
wish fulfillment for him, right? Captain Nemo.
He went to America once for a week. He did have a series of boats. He really liked the sea. There is some legends around him potentially being a stowaway when he was a young kid, which we'll talk about. Whether or not that is true is unknown. But mostly he spent his entire life in France, and everything he was writing about really was based off of exhaustive research of other papers. People like journalists would go to places and write about what it was like in other parts of the world, and he would take that stuff and put it into his books.
Yeah.
And most of this stuff he never saw for himself. Around the World in 80 Days, like those kind of books, like a lot of that was just based off of the stuff he read.
That's pretty impressive.
I think that's really cool, honestly, that he was able to do that. Yeah, we're going to spend a lot of time talking about that. I just want to describe the episode a little bit for people. We also are going to get into the book itself. We're going to spend a good chunk of time on that. It is probably the most famous underwater novel, I think, safe to say. I am currently querying literary agents with an underwater science fiction novel. I have a lot of thoughts about it as it relates to the book I wrote, especially since I hadn't read this at the time when I wrote the book. But I don't want the episode to be about that. So we're going to include a little section at the very end if people are curious, where I'll talk about some of that stuff. It might come up a little bit, but I'm going to save most of it for the end. Let's talk a little bit generally about like how we felt about the book.
Yeah. So I think I remember the first half of the book well. Second half of the book goes to some wild places. And I found,
maybe you never finished it.
as a modern reader, there's a few things that I bounced off of. The first is the pacing is really weird. It's sometimes it's breakneck. Sometimes it's like they're spending so much time talking about the intricacies of the ecosystem in some area. And I just found it to be like kind of inconsistent, and that kind of threw me for a loop. There were times where I was like, okay, I'd like to move through this a little faster, maybe. Typically I'm the kind of person that's fine with a slow burn, but it's the rapid change was a little much for me. And then just the sensibilities of a modern reader for somebody who wrote a book in 1870, whatever you said, two.
Yeah.
There was some racism. There's like just like unabashed racism too, to where it's like they're calling people savages, and they're like,
it was the thinking of the time for people in France, of a certain social status that Jules Verne was, that there were like hierarchies of people, and he identified with our main character. Now, some of it is questioned a little bit, I'll grant, but for the most part, yeah, it's pretty blatant, and it's definitely tough as a modern reader. I just have to look at it like an archaeologist, right?
Yeah.
Going back and reading something this old. To put it into context, the only other books we've read that are older than this, I believe, are Jane Austen novels, Emma and Pride and Prejudice.
Wow.
Even A Princess of Mars was written in 1912, so 40 something years after.
Technically,
this.
Snow White is a
Yeah, so I was gonna say the
story.
only other exceptions are we've covered a couple of like old fairy tale type stories that go way back, obviously, and have unknown origins. And then like Green Knight, stuff like that, where it's like very, very ancient. But as far as like novels, yeah, only a few, right? So I think it's important. That's probably part of what's going on. The way it was published is, I think, influences this, and also the way a lot of his stuff was published is they would be released as like periodicals in these magazines, chapter by chapter, and each chapter needed to deliver a new awesome tableau, the ongoing adventures, right? And you would see a new place, and it would describe all the things that are in there. And he goes really on and on about the flora and fauna and what it looks like. His whole theme that recurs over and over again in his work is the man versus nature theme that, like, honestly, you think that The Martian is like an example of that today, but in general isn't as popular today as it was back then. He is much more interested in engaging with that than like questioning the ramifications of technology and how it will affect us, and philosophically, ethically, that kind of stuff that you might look at someone like Mary Shelley and say that's a lot more what Frankenstein was about, right? And about, like, philosophical questions about what it means to be a person. He doesn't get into that kind of stuff as much. He's much more interested in like what technology is going to enable us to do as humans, where it can take us, and then leaning into the adventure of that, because he got very popular with a young audience. He was like famous for being something that young boys loved to read. And when he got famous for that and started making tons of money, that became his thing, right? And we can talk about how that affected his body of work.
One of the things I definitely wanted to highlight was how self-contained each of these stories felt in every chapter. And so the fact that it was released by chapter makes a ton of sense. It does feel like the sort of like bedtime story where it's you can sit down with your kids, read a little bit, and say, until next time, here's the cliffhanger. Think about this.
And that's interesting because I think that's just a modern interpretation of that kind of storytelling. You could also look at it as episodic as like television, right? A lot of TV episodes will do that, right? They'll tell a somewhat contained story, but then there'll be a linking thing at the end, some sort of hook to take you into the next chapter, into the next episode.
Yeah. But even just the fact that like each individual chapter almost has its own morality tale in it, or it's focusing on a different thing. It's not necessarily like tying all of the chapters together.
True. Yeah, it's the ongoing adventures of our characters, right? Which we'll definitely get into. It was kind of difficult, and it went on. It was kind of laborious at times with all of the like overwhelming level of detail. And it's difficult too for me because I knew that a lot of it was extrapolations on existing science at the time. Some of that science that he's basing it off on has since been proven to be inaccurate or insufficient. But then also the extrapolations he was making sometimes would be something that would pan out, and other times is stuff that was not possible. This didn't lead to that. This wouldn't show that. That's not what this would have been like. And as someone who's done a lot of research into underwater stuff for my book, I was, a lot of times I was like, well, that's inaccurate. That's not how this would look. That's not, and I having all these stuff going on too. But then, just like a laundry list of descriptions of different creatures and the way, the plants were and all this stuff. And like, that's not the most interesting thing for me to read. Just admittedly, like I am much more interested in character. I'm much more interested in drama and interpersonal struggle. Even as I explore a scientific adventure, I connect with the people, and I definitely felt very distant from a lot of our characters here. I did find Nemo, and I think he's one of the most famous characters in literature for this reason, but I found Nemo to be very interesting. He's very mysterious. He's often referenced, much has been written about him as a character. But our main character is Professor Aronnax and his servant, and then this like harpooner, Ned, that comes along. His name
is Ned Land, and they call him Land all the time.
And then we have his servant Conseil, who is definitely kind of a problematic character throughout. And those are our three like main touchstones, but really is Professor Aronnax. He's writing this in first person, purporting it to be like, I spent all this time in the past with Nemo, let me tell you about it. And that part of that was some of the appeal of his books, from what I understand, is like this was still a time where people were very unclear about the difference between news and fiction. So when they were reading this stuff, often people thought like this was real. This was like a real report. And when they read about the balloons, like he had this book, it's not Around the World in 80 Days. It's like 5 Weeks in a Balloon. I think it was an early novel. Okay. It was published around the same time that like a real inventor had made a balloon and attempted a long distance travel. It didn't get as far as it did in the book, but they came out around the same. It came out around the same time that actually happened. So a bunch of people bought it thinking it was like a real report of what the guy had done. So he was like sometimes get lucky with that kind of it was kind of like a wink, wink, nod, nod. I'm sure lots of people knew it was fiction, but I'm sure there were a lot of other people who were looking at it and go like, oh, is this actually based off of the real thing? It was unclear.
I mean, even into the 90s, people were still like, things like Blair Witch were making people like question whether the fiction is real or not. So yeah, it's funny to think back to a time where it would be even more so.
Well, and thinking about that, this was a time where science was starting to shrink the world. It was starting to bring everybody together, and all of a sudden traveling the world was becoming more possible for an average person than it had ever been before. And so the sense of adventure and like every day there was a new amazing thing coming out that was changing. It was the Industrial Revolution. Like it was changing life as we knew it. And so Jules Verne was sort of riding that wave, and people would read that and go like, what's next? Where is this technology going to lead us? And he was telling adventure stories full of just wonderful, crazy things happening, right? Going to the center of the earth, seeing dinosaurs in a hollow earth, like all this stuff. Like people were like, oh my God, I can't believe this is where we're going. And a lot of that, of course, is not how it panned out, but every now and then there was some stuff that panned out, and he's pretty famous for that as well.
You talked about some of the things that I bounced off of. In terms of an adventure story, the highs were pretty high for me, especially putting myself in the shoes of somebody reading it of the time period. The inventive nature of getting to see basically every type of climate, every type of possible place in the earth, and some that are not possible but are like fantastical versions, was really fun. And I thought that Nemo being this mysterious figure who I thought for sure we were going to get some backstory on, we never do, because there's sort of some hints that he's from an oppressed people, and so like he kind of supports those types of people in general, but then he's also kind of vicious sometimes, so you're not really sure what Nemo's whole motivation is.
I'm gonna circle back to that because I have a lot of backstory as to why Nemo is the way he is.
Okay, cool. And then the other thing is, when I was a child, I thought that 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea meant like down. 20,000 20,000 leagues down, and I went and looked how long a league is. You cannot go 20,000 leagues down under the sea. This is how far they traveled. No, but I think that's a
common misunderstanding of a title. Like even I was unsure what exactly it was referring to, right? But it's actually referring to the fact that like they went 20,000 leagues around the world. Most of it spent under the sea.
Exactly. Yeah. So I but then I, in my memory of it, I was like, Jules Verne kind of like, there's dinosaurs in the center of the earth. Maybe they do go down there somewhere on Earth that they go 20,000 leagues down. You just don't know.
I didn't know, honestly. I'd never read the book before. I wasn't sure what the 20,000 leagues was referring to.
Right.
And I was like, well, if they're going under that much pressure, I'm sure he's got a lot of that wrong, but we'll see how it goes,
Yeah, exactly.
I'm not a scientist, admittedly, so I'm not going to like fact check Jules Verne. I'm not confident enough in my knowledge of that. I just was able to recognize a lot of the stuff he was describing was accurate, and a lot of the other stuff was not, or it was like borderline. He was extrapolating out on real things, but then maybe taking it in directions that, didn't pan out. But it was still very cool to see. And like, honestly, that's something I did a lot in my book as far as like trying to extrapolate out on existing technologies. So which we can touch on at the end.
And pressurized vessels under the water became very relevant to a lot of people recently. So in thinking
Ocean Gate.
Yeah,
this is taking for posterity. This is taking place. I don't know, like a month or so after Ocean Gate and the disaster there, and the 5 billionaires lost in an implosion. I definitely was thinking about that.
Yeah, it's hard
while
not to.
Reading this book. I also am playing a game called Dredge. Well, I was playing a game called Dredge. And I was listening to the audiobook at times because I tend to switch between the two. And have you played Dredge?
No.
Okay, so Dredge is a Lovecraftian horror-inspired fishing sim. And awesome. You literally are in this little like boat cruising around. It's all like, it's got a cool art style. And you're going around to like different villages and talking to people, and they're all like saying weird, creepy shit, and like you fight madness at night. Like whenever it becomes night, like fog rolls in, and like you start getting chased by weird shit. It's a very fun game. I really enjoyed it, and I was listening to this book for a lot of while I was playing it, because it's also one of those games kind of like where you're doing some busy work, you're fishing, you know what I mean? So it's easy to like do something else while playing it. And so I thought that was just a fun lineup. I feel like I'll always think of Dredge now when I think of 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea.
Yeah. I like to think of games like that you can play sort of in the background as like ADHD aids.
Totally.
Like it helps me to focus on other things if I can do something else with my hands or
Yep.
something.
I need to have busy work I can do while I'm
Right.
doing that. I'm with you, man.
That sounds like a cool game.
Yeah,
And
it was fun. I just beat it. It has two different endings. And you can get both of them pretty easily, which is pretty cool.
I want to talk a little bit too about like thinking about the story and seeing things that happen in the story, especially now as an adult, having consumed a lot more material. Reading this story and seeing where people were influenced by this story has been really interesting. Like almost anything underwater is in some way
Oh yeah.
referencing this story, and I just I can't help but think about like the magnitude of the influence of something like this, and Jules Verne maybe in general. I'd like to hear more about that. It seemed like he set the stage for other people to write stories like this, and even in his
Yeah.
book he's referencing like Moby Dick and some things like that now and again, so
Right.
it's cool to see that kind
At
of.
some point, I feel like we're gonna tackle Moby Dick. I'm not necessarily looking forward to it. I'm interested. But I just know that is a massive tome and full of a lot of jargon about whaling. So I'm not necessarily looking forward to the experience of reading it, even though it's such an important novel. Maybe I'll enjoy it more than I think. I don't know.
Literary great, right? Like one
Yeah.
that is one of those books that I feel like you have to read before you die.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And you're totally right. Like, yes, he was influenced by all these other authors at the time. He's definitely influenced by that. It's referencing Odysseus and like ancient works. He was a big fan of Victor Hugo. I think was his like literary like idol.
Okay.
Even though his favorite author I think I read was Poe. But yeah, I mean, his influence it can't be overstated. As far as science fiction goes, and especially the sort of like space adventure that we're used to now. That vibe, I think he was the one who really kicked that off. And the other thing is like he is so popular. I was kind of shocked to learn, and we'll start diving into his bio here a little bit because it has some answers for you and some of your questions you've raised. But he is the second most translated author
Wow.
behind only Agatha Christie,
I was gonna say it must
ahead
have
of
been,
William
right?
Shakespeare.
Wow, that's crazy.
Isn't that wild?
Yeah.
That's what I read. Second most translated author in the world. So when you're talking about influence, that shows you, enough.
Yeah.
So let's get into the man a little bit, and then we can circle back to his legacy. Jules Gabriel Verne was born in 1828 and would die in 1905. He was a French novelist, poet, and playwright. His collaboration with the publisher Pierre-Jules Hetzel led to the creation of the Voyages Extraordinaires, a series of best-selling adventure novels including Journey to the Center of the Earth, 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, and Around the World in 80 Days. His novels, always well documented, are generally set in the second half of the 19th century, taking into account the technological advances of the times. So I watched a bunch of stuff about this guy. I watched some documentaries. I read a bunch of stuff. My copy had like this whole introduction written out that talked about him. So there's a lot of interesting stuff. I'm not going to be able to get through all of it, and I recommend people look for that kind of stuff if they want to know more. I'm going to touch lightly on some of what I remember. One thing you asked about was his venturing in his life and how much he got out. Legend has it that at the age of 11, Verne secretly procured a spot as cabin boy on the three-mast ship the Coralie with the intention of traveling to the Indies and bringing back a coral necklace for his cousin Caroline, which was his first love, by the way. He had a big crush on her and she rejected him. But the evening it was to set out for the Indies, that supposedly his father arrived just in time to catch his son and told him that he had to promise to travel only in his imagination. And supposedly this legend is an exaggerated tale of something that actually happened, but it's unknown how much is true. Apparently his first biographer kind of invented this thing and played it up as the genesis or his adventuresome spirit. Speaking of his home life, he basically was raised to become a lawyer. That was what his father wanted for him. He was kind of a nerdy kid, didn't do well with the ladies. Like I said, his first big crush was on his cousin. She ended up rebuffing him. He went to Paris to go to college, essentially. And instead of studying law, he got immersed in the artistic scene in Paris. And this ended up becoming like really foundational for him as a writer. And this was to the great disappointment of his father, who wanted him to be a lawyer. And then he also fell in love with a woman there, and they had like a courtship, but she ended up marrying someone else who had like better prospects, because at the time he only had like one coat to his name, and he was trying to be an artist rather than trying to do something more respectable, quote unquote. However, he did meet a bunch of people. He apparently became friends with Alexander Dumas' father, who like kind of took him under his wing. So Dumas would be a contemporary of his then. That's like a Three Musketeers author.
Okay.
So this ended up becoming very important for him, right? And he was reading Victor Hugo at the time, who was alive and writing. He was enmeshed in the sort of French literary scene at this time. It was also a time of great political upheaval in France. I don't know a lot of the details, but France has gone through a lot of periods of political upheaval. So this was one of those times, from what I understand. And he actually was quite politically opinionated, and he had a lot of thoughts about that we'll circle back to. So in 1841, he would publish his first novella called The Mutineers, and this book actually ended up having a lot of the hallmarks of his fiction. It included technical details. It included a character who was struggling with nature. It was an adventure story. And it did okay. He took this to heart, right? He had been doing a bunch of research. He had this habit of going to the library and just reading all kinds of stuff in particular, but also scientific papers at the time, all this stuff that was like available to him in the library. And this was a lifelong habit he would cultivate, and it would eventually become very important for his work to do that. Next up, he ended up becoming married to a woman named Honoree, and this marriage would end up becoming quite fraught throughout his entire life. They did have children together, but it didn't seem like he was really in love with her. She didn't really know what to make of him. He agreed to become a stockbroker in order to sort of appease her. She was from money. She didn't really know what to make of his writing. She considered it kind of a weird hobby he had. She wasn't interested in reading any of it early on. And so especially for a while when he was trying to kick off his writing career, he was also at the same time trying to start this career as a stockbroker. His father was like, what the fuck? Like, I thought you were going to be a lawyer, and then you wanted to be a writer, and now you're going to be a stockbroker. Like, what's going on? But he's like, yeah, this is just, I got to make ends meet. So totally understand how that would happen, right?
Yeah.
And he writes this book, 5 Weeks in a Balloon, and he can't find a publisher for it. And eventually is Dumas, I can't remember if it was himself or his father, ends up putting him in contact with a man named Jules Hetzel. So apologies if I'm mispronouncing these names. But it's Pierre Jules Hetzel. I've just seen it shortened to Jules sometimes. You can't really talk about Jules Verne without talking about Hetzel, in my opinion, because of how important this man ended up being. Hetzel and him become friends in the sense that he is going to be his publisher. Hetzel's 14 years older than him, so a little bit wiser. He's a publisher, right? So he knows marketing. He knows like how to get books out into this current climate. Mm-hmm. And Hetzel puts out his book, and like I said, it coincided with another, like this guy actually doing a balloon, like flying in a balloon, and so it had some success. And so Hetzel said, "Okay, well, what's next? What else do you got for me?" I might be wrong about some of the order of this, but essentially, one of the first books that Verne gave to Hetzel after the success of 5 Weeks in a Balloon was a book called Paris in the 20th Century. Now, Paris in the 20th Century was a dark vision of the future in which Paris had become obsessed with money. It was a bustling, overcrowded city. It had so much technology and people in it that it was affected by pollution in the air. It was a world where art had been devalued and everyone cared about like capital. And the main character was a young poet, like trying to find purpose in this new version of the future. There was even this like super tall steel structure that a lot of people said sounds a lot like the Eiffel Tower, which wouldn't be built for another 20 years.
Wow.
So kind of wild, right? But he gave this book to Hetzel, and Hetzel looked at it and said, we can't publish this. This is too dark. Your readers aren't going to like it. You're going to have to give me something else. And he basically said no.
To the dystopian future. So maybe an early dystopian
He said, no,
novel.
this is too dark. This is too troubling. This isn't going to appeal to your younger audience, which he was already starting to cultivate. Mm-hmm. Said no. So Jules Verne throws that in a trunk somewhere, trunks the book, and changes course, writes Journey to the Center of the Earth. Journey to the Center of the Earth establishes him again as a very popular author. He wasn't yet like wealthy off of his books, but he does well. Hetzel had definitely had a like plan for how to market these books. He had the means. I think he owned multiple magazines. He was able to start publishing them in periodic segments, right, that readers became invested in. It's unclear whether or not the sharing of the profits was entirely ethical. It's hard to know, so far removed, but it seems like maybe Hetzel was the bigger beneficiary of this relationship. But Jules Verne considered him a good friend, published almost all of his books with him, and he was the main editor of his work. He everything that Verne ended up publishing came through him. What he would edit out is anything that was politically upsetting for people or for other countries, because Verne was already starting to become internationally popular. Specifically, in 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, this would become very relevant, which he would write in a couple of years here. Before we get to that, though, he wrote a book called From Earth to the Moon, which I think is notable because in that book, he predicted a lot of things about space travel that would actually come true, including picking a spot 100 miles away from, Cape Canaveral in Florida, predicting that it would have to launch from Florida, a rocket, and then even predicting like around where it would need to land in the ocean after it returned. Described the ship in ways that were actually pretty accurate to how it would end up, the rocket would actually become. All kinds of things ended up being pretty close to accurate. And this is one of those that people look at and go like, how did he do this?
Yeah.
100 years before space travel would be possible.
I wonder, yeah. I mean, maybe he just understood the temperatures would be better for launches. I don't know.
Well, apparently the real reason is similar to the reason he chose, which is being closer to the equator is better for space travel. And so that's why we launched from Florida. It's because it's the closest point to the equator and the continental U.S. So apparently that's why. And he touched on that too. He was a fan of America. He went there, like I said, for like 1 week, one time. And he was a big fan of I think this is around the time of some of those world fairs. There was a lot of innovation going on. It seemed like America was really like an up and coming country that had a lot of go-getters who were like inventing stuff and wanting to push things forward. So I think he was fond of that. And that's why I think he picked America to be the one to launch this rocket. So that's a notable book in that regard, even if it's not one of his like most well read. And then he would write 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. Legend has it he wrote much of it on the ship back from America, via ship. He was on board a ship as he wrote it. Unclear whether or not that's true. There's a lot of legends about him. Take with a grain of salt.
Yeah.
Another thing to mention about Jules Verne, incredibly prolific. He would deliver 3 books a year on average. He ended up publishing 66 novels over the course of his career. So he averaged about 3 books a year, which is pretty insane. That is a very fast author, considering how well researched these books were too. If you think about it,
Yeah, definitely.
And he was often, at this time, he was still trying to work his normal job because he wasn't making enough money off of his books yet to become a full-time author. 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea would be his next hit. This was a popular book at the time. It predicted an advanced electric submarine. Now, someone had invented a working submarine prototype in the 1800s. The man called it the Nautilus, which is what he ended up calling his ship here as homage to him. So it was an existing technology, but nothing like what we see here, right? And a lot of what we see with the Nautilus in this book is well ahead of his time, and much of it became possible with future iterations, right? So, but one of the things that sets this book apart is the character of Captain Nemo. So Captain Nemo was originally envisioned by Jules Verne to be of Polish descent. He was to have lost his family, his wife and kids. He was going to be a Polish aristocrat, I think, nobleman. His children and his wife were killed in a Russian imperialist war against Poland, because that is something that had really happened.
Yeah,
Russia had really waged war on Poland, as I understand it. he sent that to Hetzel, and Hetzel said, so you're published in Russia. France just signed a treaty with Russia, and now they're allies. So we can't be publishing a book that makes Russia look bad. So apparently this actually made him pretty angry, Verne, and he has some angry letters back and forth about it, but he wound up capitulating to it. And instead of giving him another backstory, he said, you know what I'm going to do? I'm just going to make him have a mysterious backstory. He's just going to kind of have no backstory. And so he stripped it all away. You can still see some remnants of it in there, but he made him of an ambiguous nationality. He had I think we have references to the kids and the wife, but like we don't know why. Yeah. He doesn't ever name a specific country. And in fact, even the name Nemo apparently is a translation of a term that Odysseus gave to the Cyclops. Yeah. And it means nobody or no one.
I thought you were going to say it's a little clownfish or something that they have to go find. You know?
Yeah, that was Pixar a little later.
Little reference there too. Yeah. I wonder if stripping away his backstory made him more mysterious and more alluring to people.
Well, that's the thing. Like on one hand, it's a little frustrating, and people have pointed out that Verne was a lot more political than his books were, because Hetzel actively took out anything that would be upsetting to the time. And anything he saw in there that might get him banned in like a different country, like Russia, he would say, take it out. And yeah. Verne did it. So for that reason, a lot of his books are sort of sanitized, and we don't have the original versions of most of them, right? We only have the versions that got published. So it's hard to know what they would have been like without that influence. And in fact, he often would take out anything that was like potentially upsetting to like, you know what I mean? To like anybody. Yeah. And he would try and get them as commercially accessible and popular as he could make them. Now, on one hand, you could say that contributed to Verne's massive success. That's why he was so popular. That's why he's so well known today. But on the other hand, you can be frustrated for the censorship of maybe what we would have gotten. And the reason I brought that Future in Paris book up earlier is that novel was found by his great-grandson in a safe in a garage.
Wow.
And it was eventually published in 1994 for the first time.
Oh, that would be cool to read too.
And apparently this is like one of the best examples of what we might have seen had he not been edited by Hetzel throughout his entire career.
It also sounds just intriguing for a Jules Verne novel, like a dystopian, Paris.
Yeah, so I'm kind of interested in that book, to be honest. But yeah, I thought that was cool. His great-grandson found it.
Pretty legendary. That's
pretty cool. The book that would really make him as popular as we know him today was Around the World in 80 Days. That book went off like crazy. It was viral for the time, It was so popular that it actually became one of the first novels that had merchandise. There were games, there were board games made Around the World in 80 Days. There were likenesses, there were things that were sold with it. It immediately got adapted into a play that ran for 50 years and went all over the country and all over the world. And a lot of his books ended up becoming plays after this. And this is what made him wealthy. This book was so popular that he truly had the level of success that we sort of associate with him today. Also, this book is credited with being the inspiration for, if not on purpose, but serving as the inspiration for the steampunk genre and its entire aesthetic. So that's why you'll often see Jules Verne associated with steampunk.
I can definitely see that. When Nemo was describing some of the inner workings of the vessel and the sort of how it looked, I could, because it was like a weird form of electricity, and I was definitely thinking along those lines.
Well, a lot of his work has sort of retroactively been considered that. It's also that like late 19th century vibe,
right? But
specifically Around the World in 80 Days, the balloons and something about the attire that I think they were described as wearing with the goggles and all that stuff. Like that's
and
the
top
steampunk
hat.
Aesthetic.
I see. Yeah,
a lot of it comes from him. Pretty cool talking about his influence, right? Being so huge. Unfortunately, his personal life was not great during all of this. He was unhappy with his marriage, as I told you. Eventually his wife did come around to being on board and proud of him. Obviously he was bringing in money, but their relationship was still very cold. He had a son who he had a very fraught relationship with. His son apparently got into a lot of trouble. He ended up having to pay out like 200,000 francs at one point just to like offset his son's debts. They had a very tumultuous relationship, which apparently made it into several of his books, like a father-son dynamic. The other thing I should say, got to give a little bit of credit to Hetzel, even though like he can sometimes be viewed as a villain. Hetzel had been asking Verne to include some romance in some of his books, and Verne kept refusing. Verne was like, I don't want that in there. It's a distraction. I'm not interested in writing it. He finally relented, and in Around the World in 80 Days, apparently there's a romance at the heart of that plot. I don't know much about it, but it became his most famous novel. So that's the kind of thing where you're like, well, maybe Hetzel was onto something there.
Yeah. It's surprising to me that Around the World in 80 Days was his most famous, because it feels like Journey to the Center of the Earth might be bigger in my mind, but yeah.
Yeah, it's hard to say what's more famous now. It was the biggest hit of its time, and it made him the most money. Yeah, I don't know what has gone on. 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea might be his most famous now. I don't know. There's a lot of very famous ones that he wrote, right? It's one of those probably, though, like Journey to the Center of the Earth, like we said. One of those probably, but I don't know which one's the most. But as I was talking about his personal life, he apparently he found some happiness at some point when he started seeing a mistress. He would have Hetzel write letters to him, and he would say like, tell me I need to come to Paris at this exact day to come like look at proofs, and then Hetzel would do it. So like Hetzel was kind of in on it and would request him to come to Paris, and that's where he would see his mistress, which apparently did bring him a lot of joy in it, like later in his life. But then in, I think it was 1885, three things happened, all very close to one another, that kind of changed him for the rest of his life. His mistress died. He got shot in the leg by a nephew who, quote, went mad. So I don't know what was up with that. And then Hetzel passed away, all within very close to each other. And this made him a very different person going forward. Apparently he had to give up his boats because he couldn't balance enough. He developed a limp, couldn't balance himself enough on his boats, which is like one of the things that he would often go on and like to get away from his family that he didn't like very much. And so that was like one of the things that he really loved that was taken away from him. And then apparently his books got a lot darker and a little more pessimistic about science and where it was taking humanity. Because for a long time, his books were all about like joyful, like science is going to do all this great stuff for us. And then like his later works were a little bit less of that. But he continued working right up until his death, from what I understand, up until the age of 77 when he passed away. He was still working, he was still writing, continued to be prolific throughout his entire life. Hugely influential. The inventor of the first helicopter was inspired by a book that Verne wrote where he described a helicopter in it. The inventor of what would become a modern advanced submarine was inspired by 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, said so. The man who first went to the North Pole was inspired by reading about that happening in a Jules Verne novel.
Yeah.
Just this kind of stuff. Like all these kids grew up reading these adventure books and reading about the science. And a lot of them wanted to make it happen, wanted to make it real. So his influence is like immeasurable, I think, in some ways, in the way that it inspired people to actually create things and to do things. So that's really incredible. And another podcast author we've covered, Ray Bradbury, summarized Verne's influence on literature and science the world over by saying, quote, "We are all, in one way or another, the children of Jules Verne." So yeah. I think that's a good way to leave his bio, but like I've left out a lot, but it just to show how important he is for the genre as a whole. And, maybe he's not the originator of science fiction, but like the kind of science fiction I think people often associate with like, space travel and that kind of stuff. You could argue he's at least one of, if not the father of that.
The way that an artist can plant an idea, some imaginary thing in someone's mind, and then they can pursue that as like a goalpost and say that's what we want to do. It's pretty incredible to see that, and we've seen that many, many times, but Jules Verne seems to have done it in a very specific way at a very specific time that makes his legacy kind of stand on that, if nothing else. If he didn't sell the second most books ever, he inspired people to create some of these amazing technological advancements.
I don't know about sales, but second most translated. Is that the same as sales? I don't know, maybe. But let's move into the book. I know we're going to end up running long here, so I want to jump right into it. So during the year 1866, ships of various nationalities sight a mysterious sea monster, which might be a gigantic narwhal. The U.S. government assembles an expedition to find and destroy the monster. Professor Pierre Aronnax, a French marine biologist, is in town at the time and receives a last-minute invitation to join the expedition. Canadian whaler and master harpooner Ned Land and Aronnax's faithful manservant Conseil are also among the participants. The expedition leaves Brooklyn aboard the frigate Abraham Lincoln, then travels south into the Pacific Ocean. After a 5-month search ending off Japan, the frigate locates and attacks the monster, which damages the ship's rudder. Aronnax and Land are hurled into the sea, and Conseil jumps into the water after them. They survive by climbing onto the monster, which, they are startled to find, is a futuristic submarine. They wait on the deck of the vessel until morning, when they are captured, hauled inside, and introduced to the submarine's mysterious constructor and commander, Captain Nemo.
I love the setup, the idea of a monster in the water that's taking down ships, and this legend growing as communication between the UK and the US are sort of getting closer. That was really fun, and I was really invested, and I like the way that that first chapter sets it off in like sort of a different POV before we get into Aronnax.
So for me, I was unclear on like how significant the I assumed octopus, maybe squid. Actually, I think I was thinking more squid, was going to be in this story. Mm-hmm. And there was talk about, potential Leviathan. There was a lot of discussions about like, what is this thing? I quickly figured out that it was the submarine. But for a moment, I was like, is this the like creature? Are we setting up the creature that's going to become important at the end? Because I had never read this book before. And then, I thought it was fun that like it showed that they had no concept of what this could possibly be. So they assumed it was this gigantic narwhal, like spearing ships and shit.
Yeah. And, somebody at some point says that the technology is like 100 years ahead of its time. And he pretty much nailed that too. It kind of was 100 years ahead of its time. Nemo was, like you said, the cast of characters are a little two-dimensional.
Conseil is just so cringy because he's supposed to be like 30, yet Aronnax calls him my boy constantly. He's like, all right, boy, good, you're such a good boy. And I'm just like, oh, stop. And then like he is so devoted and like, oh, I would throw myself into the sea for master and all this stuff. It was like he was like Dobby almost, right? It was kind of cringy to hear and like to imagine this guy. And it was clearly like what is the like dream of a manservant, right? Like it's clearly like the ideal manservant being described here, and it's just kind of gross.
Yeah. And then Ned Land, right?
Ned.
Is this like
I can't get over Ned, man.
It's so funny.
That guy never saw an animal he didn't want to murder and eat.
Yeah, that was the thing,
and
right?
He continues to never see an animal he doesn't want to murder and eat.
He'll throw rocks at birds. He'll spear giant seals, whatever they call them.
He sees something. He's like, I want to fucking get my harpoon. I wish I had my harpoon right now, man. I want to stab that thing.
My harpoon, you don't even know. You don't even know.
And
what
often he does murder the thing and eat it.
He does. Yeah, which is actually really sad and fucked up. There's like Nemo at one point tells him he's not allowed to kill a group of whales. And I was like, good on you, Nemo. And then we'll get there, but eventually, then he proceeds to like ram the submarine into the predators of the
whales anyway.
Yeah, Ned, very two-dimensional kind of action hero that, I think you can look at Jules kind of doing his wish fulfillment all across the board. I think he wants to be like Nemo. He identifies with Aronnax. Ned is like the ultimate sort of macho, take care of business kind of guy. And then he's got the manservant. So it's like all this wrapped up in some sort of fantasy for Jules. And, the manservant thing might even be of the time. It's very probably of the time as well.
Yeah. So it's like both sides of it, right? Like Professor Aronnax represents the like learned man who's out there because he's curious about the world and he's got all these theories, but now he's getting to like live it. And Ned Land is instead the other adventurous type, which is the hunter, right? Who like wants to go and hunt, in Africa and wants to go and hunt all these, this game. And that was very exciting for people at the time. And for a lot of, it was, even today we see that is still a thing. But I think he appealed to readers in that regard too. And he's kind of more of an everyman, which I think made people who aren't necessarily professors be able to come on board with this a
Yeah.
little more.
And someone who responded really well, like I was a young boy that liked comic books that would give me an issue and then we'd have a week off or a month off and we get another issue. Like I can only imagine what it was like getting this story doled out in the 1870s. And like trying to find copies of it and continuing on this journey. And honestly, there's probably some of it where you can miss a couple and then jump back in and realize they're just in another part of the world pursuing whatever ends Nemo's trying to get to, which again, Nemo's motivation doesn't even really, it starts to come to fruition, but I guess we'll talk about it a little bit here. He like kind of wants to just like help oppress people, but then also leave this like lasting legacy, but then also burn his legacy to the ground.
It's he purports to want to help oppressed people. We see him on occasion help people.
Yeah.
But really it seems to me like he is living like a hermit life now. Like he is all about like
he's like disillusioned. Right?
And I've seen him called kind of like a libertarian hero, and I can get that because he basically says like no government applies to me. I am the master of my own world and the sea. Everything that I am, see is something I can claim. No law applies to me here. He gets really mad if anybody brings up any sort of things being against the law. He is a law in and of himself. He's a very sort of dark romantic figure. I love that he plays like an organ. It's like just imagine him down at the bottom of the sea, like rocking out on an organ. Yeah. It's very cool, right? And he's very mysterious. On occasion, though, he surprises me because he does talk about like oppressed people. He's kind of anti-imperialist, it seems. He decries a lot of like the things that different countries are doing to different peoples.
Yeah. And yet at the same time, he seems a little bit like a colonizer at times, right?
Oh,
like
totally.
He wants to, so there's like he's kind of having it both ways, or he wants to.
Yeah.
And I think it's because,
but I mean, like I think it is radical to have even a character like that
at the time
express some sort of criticism of it, right?
Yeah.
Like somewhat radical for a book again that was being edited by Hetzel, who wasn't allowing Verne to be radical at all.
Right. And the main character, Aronnax, would basically like any group of native people he saw, he was like savages and this and that,
yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And so Nemo at one point challenges him.
Exactly. And I think Nemo's point is in his perspective, everyone is, because Nemo's so advanced or something, which
but also he's like those who you call savages like are just people who live here. Like he does say that, but then at times he'll like still kind of be very dismissive of them and treat them as subhuman. So it's not like he's always walking the walk, but sometimes he says the right things. A very politically interesting figure in that regard. Unclear whether or not he is actually just completely out for himself. He does seem very selfish to me as a figure.
Well, look at the journey. Like there's some times that they like end up in like the Arctic and he has so much hubris and he's like, I can command over all of nature. And like he puts them and the entire crew in really bad spots often.
Yeah. Totally. I mean, he's arrogant. He doesn't want to engage with anything that goes against exactly what he wants. Because he's considered himself like king of this vessel, and they're essentially prisoners. We should say. We're going to get into it here, but they're told they're not allowed to leave. So they spend years with him on the Nautilus.
And Arnak deals with some like Stockholm syndrome for sure. He's like gets to the point where he loves his captor. He
totally
wants to,
like prisoners is in air quotes because they seem to be really into it for a while.
Land is the only one who keeps trying to plan to get off. Because
they keep telling him not to like harpoon everything, and he's like, "Come on, if I can't harpoon everything, what am I gonna do?"
Well, and how on the nose is the fact that like the one who loves the land and he wants to get back. His last name is Land. Wasn't lost on me. I was like, that's hilariously on the nose.
Okay, so begins the protagonist's adventures aboard the Nautilus, which was built in secrecy and now roams the seas beyond the reach of land-based governments. In self-imposed exile, Captain Nemo seems to have a dual motivation: a quest for scientific knowledge and a desire to escape terrestrial civilization. Nemo explains that his submarine is electrically powered and can conduct advanced marine research. He also tells his new passengers that his secret existence means that he cannot let them leave. They visit many ocean regions, some factual and others fictitious. The travelers view coral formations, sunken vessels from the Battle of Vigo Bay, the Antarctic ice barrier, the transatlantic telegraph cable, and the legendary underwater realm of Atlantis. They even travel to the South Pole and are trapped in an upheaval of an iceberg on the way back, caught in a narrow galley of ice from which they are forced to dig themselves out. The passengers also don diving suits and hunt sharks and other marine fauna with air guns in the underwater forest of Crespo Island, and also attend an undersea funeral for a crew member who died during a mysterious collision experienced by the Nautilus. When the submarine returns to the Atlantic Ocean, a school of giant squid, quote, devilfish, attack the vessel and kills another crewman. That's what we were talking about. It's kind of a list of the ongoing adventures. Each one of those is a chapter. Each one of those has its own, long descriptions of what they see and explore. Yeah. Usually has Ned Land killing and eating something and describing how it tastes.
Yeah, that is true. He often, I mentioned before, these stories tend to have different themes within them. Like they'll be like, and I found a lot of them to be pretty beautiful. Like the idea of like them going in the scuba gear and going down and looking at these coral reefs and these massive jellyfish they see. They see this burial that they have. I thought was pretty cool and like an interesting look into like a culture that Nemo's kind of created. They've like almost become their own
mysterious crew
rituals. Yeah, they just like work for him. And it's like even if he was paying them money, that their entire lives are spent on this vessel.
They're essentially servants.
Yeah. But I found a lot of the ongoing adventures to actually be really engaging and fun. Like they like go to a extinct volcano at one point and like trek out of it is fun.
There's a bunch of birds in there that they eat.
There's a tunnel that doesn't actually exist that he goes like between the Red Sea and the Mediterranean.
Between different seas, yeah.
Yeah. Just very inventive and cool and fun and like seeing them dive together. But then, often, they're hunting
There's like
sharks.
A pearl that I think Nemo has been like building, and it's like he's like created like this giant clam to make it, and it's going to be worth like 500,000 pounds or something.
Yeah, but he's almost seems like he's cultivating it because of like the nature of it. To me,
just
is
because
what
he
it
can.
felt like.
Yeah, like he's not intending to sell it. He just wants to have like the biggest pearl because he knows how it works.
But the other thing too is the
shark
historic.
With a dagger.
He does, and then Ned saves him by murdering the shark with his harpoon.
Yeah, they fought a dugong, by the way, which I didn't know much about. I looked into. They're basically big old manatees.
Yeah,
there's like a whole part where they murder this dugong and eat it.
There's a Pokemon named Dugong. That's all I was imagining in my mind.
Yeah, and this is when I started to notice that they were killing everything they encountered, and that pretty much holds true. They encounter some strange animal, and then they find a way to kill it and eat it. Basically happens every time. There's
like a giant water spider. Oh, and then the historic things are fun too, right? Like historic battles or sinking of ships. And I'm a history buff. Like I like that kind of stuff. Mm-hmm. Not an expert, but I like to hear about that kind of thing and threading our world in with the magical world of Nemo, the sci-fi world that Nemo is inhabiting in Aronnax. And then Atlantis, we get Atlantis, which I was like, that was fun but it's like been surfaced,
cool
right?
Atlantis.
Yeah. It's been, but it's like not underwater any longer.
I thought they were underwater when they found it because he like writes on a rock, which maybe they couldn't talk. I think they're in those like dive suits.
You're right.
Yeah.
Yeah. There's something else that they see that's like the ruins of a city above ground. I thought.
Yeah. Occasionally they do go above and they like stop on little islands and stuff. So sometimes you can lose track of like when they're underwater and when they're not. I totally get that. They kill that whale and milk it, which I thought was really weird. Like drink the milk, and they say that it's just like cow's milk.
Well, I think that was when they were killing the predators of the whales, and that one happened to be killed by those predators. And then so they're like, "Oh, we can't let it go to waste," and they milk it. And I was like, "Can you do that?"
I don't think that.
It reminds me of the meet the parents thing, where he's like, he's milking cats or something. Like,
yeah.
I didn't know you could milk.
Nipple, you can milk.
It has nipples, I guess.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, Robert De Niro telling me that. That little science lesson. They took a trip to the South Pole. I was just thinking about like readers at the time, right? Like we all know so much about the world today. Like it's so easy to pull up a YouTube video and see what it looks like on the South Pole. See what it looks like anywhere in the world. This was a time where all of a sudden it seemed possible to go to all these places. Like there was no TV, there was no, you might see a picture, maybe photographs were starting to become a thing, drawings I think was probably mostly what you saw. Mm-hmm. So reading about this stuff had to just be like, a drug. Like I can see why this was so popular because it made you feel like you were there.
Yeah. The claustrophobia of the Arctic, by the way, they have to let's talk about the science of the Nautilus too, because I did I found myself getting really fascinated by it because they go into extreme detail about how it's powered and the drill screw thing that propels it and the way that they're
Yeah.
using electricity to power it. But basically what they do though is they come up like a whale and they,
Hmm.
bring in new oxygen for the crew. And there were times that they were getting trapped under these icebergs that kept getting us to the point where uh, it seemed like they weren't going to be able to come up because it just was an ice sheet for such a long period of time and they couldn't break through. And then they get stuck. And that was the time where like people are passing out in the ship and they're out there trying to pick away at it in their dive suits.
Yeah.
Pretty crazy stuff. Like you said, can you imagine what this would be like? Because, if you're looking at drawings for context or you're reading things in a newspaper, it's hard to think that people were imaginative to come up with this kind of stuff. So you're like, you know what?
Well, we
Maybe
already
it
talked
was.
about how people were like, maybe this really happened. Maybe this is like a guy really reporting something that happened to him.
Yeah.
Because it was like you could believe it. Maybe this is really going on. This is another good opportunity. I think we both had our copies had a lot of these original illustrations that were from around the time. A lot of them came from the magazines that it was published in, or in subsequent editions. And a lot of them were just really evocative, cool, like black and white pencil sketches. My copy above me here is like it's got a bunch of jellyfish on the cover. It's just really cool, and like I love the look and view of that. Obviously, I wrote an underwater novel, so I'm drawn to that.
Yeah.
I do think it is cool. It's like an alien space filled with life that is so unlike ours, and yet is on our planet and shares a world with us. I've always found that really fascinating, and I think Verne identified that and really leaned into it with the visuals that he often describes.
These illustrations like really made the book for me too. I loved seeing them. They were a nice way to break up some of the monotony that would happen with like technical terminology and explaining things, breaking things down to like really base levels of how it was, maybe some pseudoscience, but how it was working scientifically. And I did read that the version that came out, because like you said, it was serialized from 69 to 70, and then they published it in 71, and it included 111 illustrations by Alphonse de Neuville and
Oh, cool.
Edouard Rio. But 111
Yeah,
illustrations like that, again, that'll capture a child's imagination while they're reading through this story.
totally. Okay, let me finish this book out, and then we can put a bow on it here. The novel's later pages suggest that Captain Nemo went into the undersea exile after his homeland was conquered and his family slaughtered by a powerful imperialist nation. Following the episode of the Devilfish, Nemo largely avoids Aronnax, who begins to side with Ned Land. Ultimately, the Nautilus is attacked by a warship from the mysterious nation that caused Nemo much suffering. Carrying out his quest for revenge, Nemo, whom Aronnax dubs, quote, Archangel of Hatred, rams the ship below her waterline and sends her to the bottom, much to the professor's horror. Afterward, Nemo kneels before a portrait of his deceased wife and children, then sinks into a deep depression. Circumstances aboard the submarine change drastically. Watches are no longer kept, and the vessel wanders about aimlessly. Ned becomes so reclusive that Conseil fears for the harpooner's life until Ned announces that they are in sight of land and have a chance to escape. Professor Aronnax is ready to leave Captain Nemo, who now horrifies him, yet he is still drawn to the man. Fearing that Nemo's very presence could weaken his resolve, he avoids contact with the captain. Before their departure, however, the professor eavesdrops on Nemo and overhears him calling out in English, "Oh, almighty God, enough, enough." Aronnax immediately joins his companions and they carry out their escape plans, but as they board the submarine's skiff, they realize that the Nautilus has seemingly blundered into the ocean's deadliest whirlpool, commonly known as Maelstrom. Nevertheless, they manage to escape and find refuge on an island off the coast of Norway. The submarine's ultimate fate, however, remains unknown until the events of a later novel called The Mysterious Island that he would publish, where he actually brings back Nemo.
That's wild. I've heard of that one.
Yeah.
I feel like that's also a sequel to Journey to the Center of the Earth, right?
It
No?
might be. I don't know, because I don't think it's a direct sequel in the sense that it's all about that. But at some point in that book, Nemo shows up, and we learn more about what
Yeah.
happened to him.
Well, it's cool to have, interconnected stories like that too.
Yeah.
This far back.
Very cool, right? So yeah, let's talk about the end of the book here. So I in my version, the creature that we were referring to that attacked was actually described as a cuttlefish, which are really interesting cephalopods.
Hmm.
Cephalopods feature prominently in my book, so I was thinking a lot about them and the different kinds there are, and I was thinking about how often I've heard this interchanged, right? Like I've heard of it be described as an octopus. I've seen squids. Cuttlefish is very different than both of those. And it was definitely a cuttlefish though, because there was like certain aspects of its anatomy that lines up with cuttlefish. And this is something he would have been researching at the time. Um, really fascinating creatures. Didn't play as prominent a role as I always thought it would in this book. Now, maybe subsequent adaptations it features more prominently, but
Maybe.
here I thought it was going to like directly attack the Nautilus more. I thought we were going to see some like some more crushing as it was like wrestling with the Nautilus and like all this stuff, and like didn't really get all that.
Yeah. It would have been cool to see, and I can see where you would go there for sure. I think subsequent stories, maybe underwater
Yeah,
stories, have definitely dealt with that. I mean, it's the most terrifying. Imagine a giant, like the Nautilus is massive, and
yeah,
imagine something that dwarfs that, and they can just hold on to it, and as powerful and as advanced that ship is.
yeah.
Thinking of it like against nature again, seeing nature just. I don't know. I'm for
I
nature
thought that was
usually,
the
you know. I
final
feel like
boss of nature, right? I thought that was like the final boss we were going to face at the end, and it was going to be this like epic showdown. Didn't really
yeah.
quite get that.
We kind of got more into the man versus man here in this
Yeah.
at the end
Well, we
here.
see Nemo. Nemo's like, "Fuck these guys. This is the company, the
Yeah.
country that killed my
Shadow
people.
organization that
My
took out my
yeah,
family apparently.
yeah. Very mysterious. I'm not going to name who it is, but sinks them, and
Yep.
it's described as like them and all the crew just go down, and that's when Aronnax is like, "All right, maybe not. Maybe this is too much for me."
Yeah. The fate of the ship, Nemo, and then even the fate of the people who get off are like main cast. They like it just says that they kind of like wash up on shore.
Yeah. Well, we know that at some point Aronnax is publishing this, right? Because he's referencing this, like, because he's
Yeah.
like a
Throw out.
yeah, this is like a diary that he kept, and he's like talking about his time spent 20,000 leagues under the sea. I think we get the title here at the end, which sounds like it's going to be the name of his like manuscript he's going to put out, which gives us that sense that like, oh, that's what we're reading.
Right.
Yeah, it's very cool. There's a lot of fun visuals here. There's at one point where the Nautilus like pokes up into the air and then gets struck by lightning. I was like, oh, that was rad. That was cool. Pretty rad.
Yeah.
You
Pretty
know, like
metal. Pretty cool
yeah,
moment.
it's like electrified. Like it's got all these cool things about it. Like I love the saloon.
Mhm.
They just like pull up the window and they can just see out into the sea, and it's like, oh, you can see for miles. Like it's so clear. I was like, okay, maybe, probably not, but looks very cool here. And like a lot of this makes for some great illustrations, like we've talked about, where they like, show some really cool stuff.
Very visual. I'll be excited to see what the film does. I know older film, so it's not
Yeah.
maybe not too much special effects, but it'll be cool to see. I've never seen the film.
Yeah, me either. I think I've seen a version of 20,000 Leagues, but maybe I've only seen parts of it because I don't remember like a
I feel
full
like I
movie.
saw an animated version of some kind at one point.
I don't know. I did read that he's been adapted over 100 times into film.
Wow. Wow.
So this is like a very adapted author. Which means there's just going to be multiple versions of everything. I think I've seen Journey to the Center of the Earth. There was like a really bad
With the rock, yeah.
2000s ish era movie that
Yeah.
came out.
I think that's why I thought The Mysterious Island was a sequel. It's because of that movie, actually, because he did both of those. Yeah,
Yeah.
those could be interesting bonus episodes if we ever decide to cover those, or maybe those are just
Sure.
the straight up main feed episodes.
Yeah, I mean, I'd be interested to return to Verne. I think would want to be particular about what we choose to give us a different side to him.
Yeah.
If I can find something like that, I'd be interested to do that. But yeah, man, this was a lot of fun. I have thoughts again about this as it relates to my book, but I'll save that to the very end. But any last thoughts?
It's an adventure story, so like you kind of take that for what it is. It's obviously very influential. We've talked about that a lot. It surprised me in ways, and then in other ways it kind of was exactly what I was expecting. There was kind of a slog for me, and I think it's just the era that it was released and what people were finding very interesting. In maybe refining this as time has gone on, we've seen simplified versions and seen some things that capture some of the magic of what Jules Verne had, but he did it first. He was the originator, it seems, of a lot of this ideology and the way that sci-fi was being handled at the time. So, credit where credit's due there, and happy to read more of his material in the future.
Yeah, this is one that was kind of selfish for me. Like I wanted to cover this because it felt like this big gap in my history of sci-fi, and like I'm glad I can kind of fill that in a little bit now. Yeah, very fun, and I'm excited to cover that adaptation next week. We're going to cover the '50s one. Apparently, that's the most famous. We'll get into why, I'm sure. I'm excited to see how they managed it in a time where I'm sure special effects were very difficult to pull off. So it should be a fun one.
Yep.
If you enjoyed this episode, please let us know in the form of a rating and review, however you chose to listen. If you're on YouTube, give us a like and comment below what your favorite Jules Verne piece is, like what his work means to you. If you knew all this stuff about him as a figure in science fiction, we'd just love to hear from you in the comments. That's a good way to talk with us. I've been trying to dive in there and respond to people on our previous videos.
Yeah, and make sure that you're liking and subscribing there. Follow us on social media. We're on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. All of those at Ink to Film, and we're on TikTok. And look out for our YouTube shorts. We're all over the place.
We are on Patreon, patreon.com/inktofilm. And if you wanted to go on there, you can still have time to vote. If you are listening to this on either the day it comes out or the day after, basically you have until the end of the day Friday to get your vote in on what our next project will be. We're doing a community selection. And right now, the final 3 options are My Best Friend's Exorcism, Train Spotting, and To Kill a Mockingbird. So one of those 3 will be our next project. We'll be able to announce that hopefully next episode, what ends up winning. Yeah, if you want to vote, get over there real quick because you don't have a lot of time, but we'd love to have you weigh in.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to any of those, honestly. They all sound really fun.
Yeah, very different ways, but yeah, I'm into it.
Yeah, totally. And thank you to Ross Bugden for the use of our intro and outro music.
All right, man. So yeah, here we are at the end. I just thought this would be my moment to be a little bit selfish and talk about how this book made me feel about my own. There's definitely a lot of stuff that I felt like, oh man, I want to like do some allusions to this. Maybe I'll sneak in a couple things here or there. There's a couple of quotes I really like. Maybe I'll include a quote or something as like an epigraph. There's just a lot of fun stuff here, but ultimately it's also like, I didn't love reading this book that much. It wasn't like one of my favorite novels I've read or anything.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't like how like sanitized of politics it is. That's not how I write. My book is definitely a lot more political. It has a lot more to do with like using the setting and the situation as a metaphor to explore like real world politics and real world scenarios, and explore how I feel about life and stuff like that.
Yeah.
I focus a lot more on character, but I really appreciated the way that Verne is using science of his time to extrapolate out, because that's definitely what I'm doing in mine, in my book. So, and
I held back throughout the whole episode asking you this, but in what ways did Jules Verne sneakily influence your story? Is there anything that obviously cultural osmosis is a thing. Like, did you feel like there was some influence there?
So my current title for my book is Beneath the Neon Tide. So I don't know if that'll end up being the name it gets published under, because a lot of the times that's a marketing thing, but it has to do with a sunken Earth. It's set in the future, like 2091. The world's been sunken for 40 years after a mysterious event that flooded the world. And there is a group of sentient cephalopods who are now in control of everything, and have basically subjugated humanity and keeps them living in these underwater stations. So cephalopods are a big part of it, right? Like tentacles, the alien amongst us kind of vibe. I really like that. I think, cultural osmosis is a good way to describe it, because 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea and tentacles and like, the squid and like all of, like, that's like an image that has been foundational, I think, when I think of science fiction and underwater. Those two things are like linked, right? Like,
yeah,
sure, you got H.P. Lovecraft a little bit in there too with like the horror elements, but
you got to be thinking about like pressures and those kinds of things.
So much research about pressure, man.
Underwater firearms. I know that's something we've talked about in the past.
Yeah, underwater firearms are like one of the things that made me want to write the book, because I found out they were like a real thing that were invented. They create these cavitations in front of the bullets that make them be able to fire accurately underwater. I thought that was really interesting. And I was like, what would happen if I wrote a shootout underwater? And then like the story kind of grew from there. But that's the same kind of thing, right? Like that's an existing technology that I read about, and then I'm trying to extrapolate out. And a lot of the times when I was trying to come up with like what is essentially 2090, right? So like kind of a generation, little over a generation from now.
Mhm.
So trying to extrapolate out from the technologies we have now, if we were to put a lot of our focus into underwater life and living in that kind of an environment and living in, you know, these stations underwater. And then I have a little bit of cephalopod technology that they brought over. So there's some, I can play a little fast and loose with it at times. I'm definitely not a hard sci-fi book. I just try and play it as straight as I can with the science as much as I can, not being a scientist. So I also kind of appreciated that about Verne, is that he wasn't a scientist. He didn't have like training in science. He just read about stuff, and that's the same thing I do. Like I read about all this stuff. I watch videos. I look up specific things when I need to know how they work, and then I try and extrapolate out how it could possibly go. You know,
the deep unknown, like the black chasm beneath you, and then these pressures, like it's terrifying. Like I feel like you can't.
They call that thalassophobia. It's like the fear of the deep. Yeah, it's a real thing that people have. It's like like how would you feel if you were to like tread water in the deep ocean?
Mariana's Trench, right over top of the trench.
Well, not even that, just like the ocean, right? Like you're out in the ocean and you don't know how deep it is. You don't know what's underneath you. And like that fills people with a lot of fear. And I think I definitely have like a touch of that. I find the ocean like awe-inspiring. I find it to be a powerful metaphor, but also just like it is like nature personified. It is this like unconquered thing that covers most of our planet.
Yeah.
It's fascinating to me. I've always been drawn to it in different ways. I've always been scared of it in many different ways. And I, you know, when it came time for me to write a sci-fi novel, which is what I decided to do, I was drawn to that in the sense that it felt a little more familiar to me than space does. Which is where, you know, and I probably will write a space novel at some point, but like, it just felt like that was a little closer to home and something I had stronger feelings about. So I guess that's why I'm drawn to it, even though I'm not a diver. Like I'm not someone who has spent my life in the ocean.
You knew people who were though. Divers.
But my father's a diver, you know, and some of my family would dive. One of the reasons I didn't dive was because I was afraid to. Yeah. Like the idea of it was terrifying to me. I've taken like a dive tank and like gone in the pool and stuff. I've just never like gone actual scuba diving in the ocean. Right. I've done snorkeling and some stuff, but like, yeah, it's interesting because I definitely feel a little bit like, who am I to write this book sometimes? But
look at Jules Verne. Jules Verne didn't travel all over the place.
Gives me hope.
You know, exactly. You mentioned space too, and you know, with this Ocean Gate stuff, like I've realized more and more how like the water and going in the deep is more treacherous than going into space in some regards.
Well, it's the exact opposite, right? Because space is a lack of pressure. It is nothing. The ocean is very much something. Yeah. And that's something that I definitely lean into my book as much as possible. It's like you're not surrounded by nothingness like you are in space. And sure, there's a danger to the vacuum, but the danger is being crushed by the excessive amounts of stuff that's all around you when you're in the ocean, basically. And on top of you. Yeah. And it's full of life and it's full of other things like, and you know, ocean, it's water you can't drink. It will kill you if you drink it. Like it's always been so interesting to me. Right. Yeah. In that way. I find it really fascinating. This book was one I wanted to selfishly read because I felt like if I'm going to publish a book about underwater stuff, on an underwater sci-fi book, I need to have read this, right? Yeah. And my best way to get to read something is to cover it on the podcast. So it like guarantees I'm going to read it and talk about it and think about it, you know?
Totally.
So that's one of the reasons why I wanted to do it. So kind of selfish on this one, but you know, that's why we have a podcast. We get to do that every now and then. This was fun, and I'm glad I got to talk about it. And one day, hopefully, the book will be a real thing people can buy. Knock on wood. I just know it's going to be a few years away from that. Even thinking optimistically. So I didn't want to get too into it in the episode proper. But if you are curious about that, just, you know, follow me on social media, and one day I'll talk about it. You know, I have a website, lukeelliotauthor.com. You can look on there where I talk about my publications. I do have some short fiction and stuff out, so it's a good way to keep up with that. And I would love it if you're listening to this, if one day you would consider picking up this book that I hope becomes a thing. But yeah.
Yeah, we're looking forward to it.
All right, until next time.
Keep adapting.